Whispers of Patience. A Love on Palmar Island Romance. Written by Susanne. A haunting past, a mystery to unravel, and a love worth fighting for. When Professor Imogene Calloway returns to Palmar Island to settle her late great-aunt's estate, she expects quiet days spent packing boxes, not eerie whispers in the night. But strange things begin happening at her aunt's old house: footsteps in the hallway, ghostly figures in the garden, and the feeling that someone is watching her. As a scientist, Imogene dismisses the tales of restless spirits as superstition, but when the ghost of a long-lost island woman begins appearing, Imogene finds herself drawn into a mystery that spans generations. Everett Beauregard, a local historian and Imogene's childhood friend, has long been fascinated by the legend of Patience, a young woman whose heart was broken and whose spirit is said to wander the island in search of the engagement ring she was denied. Together, Imogene and Everett begin uncovering secrets buried deep in the island's past, and their own hearts. As the two friends grow closer, old feelings resurface, but Imogene is haunted by more than just the island's ghost. Can she open her heart to love again, or will the tragic history of Patience's lost love keep her from embracing her future with Everett? In Whispers of Patience, a love that bridges time, mystery, and the supernatural will change everything. Chapter 1. Imogene pulled into the gravel driveway and stared at the familiar sight of her great-aunt's house. She hadn't been here in years. The once white shutters were a faded gray, and ivy had crept up the side of the porch. Yet somehow, it was still the same place that had been a second home to her growing up. Her mind catalogued the changes, taking note of how time had worn the place down. What unsettled her wasn't the decay, it was the strange pull she felt in the pit of her stomach, a whisper of something she couldn't explain. This is silly, she thought, shaking her head as she turned off the car and grabbed her bag from the passenger seat. You're a scientist, not someone who believes in old ghost stories. As a professor of environmental science at the College of Charleston, Imogene prided herself on her rational approach to the world. Legends, tall tales, and the unexplained, those were for tourists. The real world was rooted in data, experiments, and things she could measure and control. But, as she stood on the porch of her great-aunt's weathered house, she couldn't shake the sensation that something was watching her. It's nostalgia, she muttered to herself as she fiddled with the old key, unlocking the front door. The familiar squeal of the hinges greeted her like an old friend. The air inside was thick with dust and the unmistakable scent of old wood. Closing the door behind her, Imogene paused in the entryway. This house was hers now. It was hard to wrap her mind around that fact. Her great-aunt had always been a larger-than-life figure. She'd been a quirky, independent woman who loved to tell stories, particularly the tale of Patience, the island's famous ghost. But Imogene hadn't come back to Palmar Island to chase ghosts. She was here to deal with her great-aunt's estate and then return to her life in Charleston. Still, standing in the dim light of the old house, she couldn't shake the feeling that the house itself was waiting for something. Imogene set her bag down on the old oak table by the staircase, glancing up at the portrait of her great-aunt that hung on the wall. The woman she was named after. The resemblance between them had always been uncanny, right down to the long, dark hair and sharp cheekbones. Family gatherings had always involved at least one person jokingly mixing them up, as though time itself had folded in on itself and the two of them had somehow become one. Well, Aunt Imogene, she said aloud to the empty room, I'm here. Let's see what you've left me. She headed for the kitchen first, the familiar floorboards creaking beneath her feet as she walked. The kitchen had always been her favorite part of the house. The cabinets were lined with floral wallpaper, and the same old kettle sat on the stove, looking as though it hadn't moved in years. A wave of sadness washed over her, one she'd been holding at bay since the funeral a few months ago. Before she could linger on it, there was a sudden thump from upstairs, the kind of sound that would make anyone jump. Imogene froze, listening intently. The house was old, of course, it made noises, but this didn't sound like settling. It sounded like footsteps. With a dismissive shake of her head, she grabbed her phone and texted Everett to let him know she'd arrived. The local historian insisted on helping her settle in, and part of her was grateful. She might not believe in ghosts, But she wasn't exactly eager to be alone in a creaky old house on her first night back. It would be nice to see a friendly face. The kettle's whistle cut through her thoughts, jolting her back to the present. She made herself a cup of tea, hoping the warm liquid would calm her nerves. Taking a deep breath, she opened the door to the porch and stepped outside. The night was quiet, with only the gentle sound of the wind stirring the marshes and the distant crash of waves against the shore. This was what she needed, fresh air and peace, far from the bustle of Charleston and her university obligations. The last time she'd set foot here, she was still in grad school, still figuring out who she wanted to be. Now, she was Dr. Imogene Calloway, with a respectable career and a logical, orderly life. There was no room in that life for ghosts or restless spirits. Her phone buzzed with a message from Everett. "I'll be over in a few. Don't get too scared without me." She smiled, shaking her head. Typical Everett. He'd been fascinated by the island's ghost stories since they were kids, always trying to convince her to go on some haunted adventure. As an adult, he only leaned further into the legends that surrounded Palmar Island, especially the one about patience. Imogene leaned against the porch railing, watching as the last sliver of the sun dipped below the horizon. The air grew cooler, a breeze sweeping through the trees, sending a shiver down her spine. "Get a grip," she muttered to herself. The stories of patience had always been just that, stories. But standing here, alone in the fading light, Imogene felt like the past was closer than she'd realized. A noise broke the silence, footsteps on the porch. She whirled around, heart racing, only to see Everett Beauregard standing there with a teasing grin. He hadn't changed much since the last time she'd seen him. His dark hair, now streaked with a few strands of gray, was tousled by the wind, and his strong jawline was softened by a few days' growth of stubble. His frame filled the doorway with an easy confidence. His blue eyes held that familiar spark of mischief, the one that used to get them both into trouble. For a moment, Imogene's breath caught in her throat. The years had been good to Everett, there was no denying that. His presence, always steady and sure, sent a warmth spreading through her, calming the nervous energy that had been thrumming under her skin since she'd arrived. "Jumping at shadows already?" he asked, stepping closer. Imogene let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "It's an old house. It's bound to make noise." "Or maybe Patience is saying hello," Everett said with a wink. "Very funny." Imogene rolled her eyes, but there was something comforting about his presence. Everett stepped up onto the porch, his eyes scanning the house. "It hasn't changed much. Still feels like the kind of place where secrets are kept." Imogene raised an eyebrow. "You're not going to start with your ghost stories already, are you?" Everett shrugged, that mischievous grin still in place. "Hey, you can't spend the night here and not expect a few bumps in the night. Patience Winthrop might be real, you know." "I think I'll stick to things I can actually prove," Imogene said, glancing back at the house, half expecting to see the figure of a woman in white. Chapter 2. Everett parked in front of Imogene's Greytant's house, balancing 2 steaming cups of coffee and a bag of pastries from the roasted bean. The air was crisp, the sun just beginning to stretch its light across the Atlantic Ocean. The island always felt calm at this time of day, the kind of calmness he loved. Stepping out of his truck, Everett grabbed the coffee, paper bag, and the folder stuffed with everything he'd been able to dig up on Patience Winthrop, the island's famous ghost. The house held the eerie charm it always had, like something from a forgotten time. A shiver of excitement ran through him. Maybe today, he'd convince Imogene that there was more to the island's legends than she wanted to admit. Before he could knock, the door swung open. Imogene stood in the doorway, dressed more casually than the other night in an oversized sweater, her dark hair tied back in a loose ponytail. There was a hint of surprise in her eyes, but it quickly melted into a soft smile when she saw the coffee. "Morning," Everett said, lifting the cups in greeting. "Brought breakfast." "Perfect timing." She stepped aside to let him in, the warmth of her presence chasing away the slight chill in the air. "I'm still getting used to the island's quiet. It's a bit of an adjustment after Charleston." Everett smiled as he set the coffee and pastries on the kitchen table. I figured. I'm sure you miss your students. Thought you could use a little help easing back into things. He looked around the kitchen, still as he remembered it, except now the silence felt heavier. How's it going, settling back in? Imogene poured herself a cup of coffee, leaning against the counter with a slight shrug. Not bad. Miss Doris stopped by to welcome me back. She brought a basket of pumpkin muffins and a good amount of gossip. Everett chuckled. Let me guess, she talked about getting older and slowing down and then caught you up on all the community projects she's involved in? Imogene smiled, taking a sip of her coffee. Exactly. And she brought up Patience Winthrop. She said my great-aunt swore she saw her a few days before she passed. Well, she's not the only one. Everett leaned forward, excited to share what he'd brought. I did a little digging about Patience. Thought you might be interested. Imogene raised an eyebrow. Still on the ghost train, huh? Hear me out. He reached into his backpack, pulling out the folder. Patience was real, you know. And there's a lot of history tied to this house, maybe more than your great-aunt let on. Imogene's fingers hesitated over the thick manila paper before she opened it, revealing a collection of old letters, maps, and a few historical records he'd found in the town archives. Patience Winthrop, 1853, she read aloud. Her family was one of the founding families on the island? Everett leaned over the old document spread across the kitchen table. It was. Her family estate was close to where your great-aunt's house is now. Imogene raised an eyebrow. Really? I didn't realize the connection went that far back. Everett nodded, pulling out another document. There's a record of the Winthrop family property lines in the late 1800s. The land your house is on used to belong to them, before it was sold off through marriage connections. Your family, the Calloways, are distantly related to the Winthrops through Patience's mother. Imogene blinked in surprise, her fingers tracing the edges of the paper. So, you're saying I'm related to Patience? Yes, Everett said, smiling. Which explains why the house stayed in your family for so long. It's been passed down through generations, probably ever since Patience's time. Imogene leaned back in her chair, a strange chill running down her spine. That explains a lot. Everett glanced at her curiously. Like what? Imogene hesitated. I don't know, but it feels like this house is tied to more than just my great-aunt. Maybe there's a reason people think they see Patience's ghost. I think there is, Everett said. How much do you know about the story? Not much. Her family wasn't exactly thrilled when she fell in love with a sea captain. The legend says her brother took the engagement ring her lover gave her, and after that, she got sick and died. Ever since, people claim her ghost wanders the island, searching for the ring. Imogene shook her head, though there was a flicker of interest in her eyes. And you think the ring is still out there? I think it could be. And I think your great-aunt might have known more than she let on. She was fascinated by local history, wasn't she? And she loved this house. Maybe she found something and never told anyone. Imogene glanced down at the papers, her brow furrowing. You really think there's something hidden here? In the house? Why not? Everett shrugged. Old houses like this? Full of secrets. She looked skeptical, but seemed more curious than before. Fine. Where do we start? How about the attic? Everett said, feeling a surge of excitement. I remember you hated going up there when we were kids. I wasn't scared, Imogene shot back, the corner of her mouth twitching into a smirk. I just didn't see the appeal of rummaging through dusty old boxes. Well, maybe there's more than dust up there. He grinned and grabbed his flashlight. You up for a little treasure hunt? Imogene sighed, but he could see her interest growing. Why not? Let's get this over with. They climbed the narrow stairs, the air growing cooler with each step. The attic door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit space filled with trunks, boxes, and forgotten furniture. Dust hung thick in the air, catching the beam of Everett's flashlight. This place hasn't changed at all, Imogene said, her voice quieter now as she took in the room. I really did hate coming up here. Everett smiled, running the beam of light over the old trunks. That's because you thought it was haunted. I don't believe in ghosts, she muttered, her eyes lingering on a large chest tucked away in the corner of the room. Everett made his way over to it, wiping the dust off the top. Look at this, he said, motioning for Imogene to join him. This chest looks older than everything else up here. Could be from Patience's time. Imogene crouched down beside him, brushing her fingers over the ornate carvings on the chest's lid. It's beautiful. Definitely hand-carved. Late 1800s, maybe. There's no lock, Everett said, lifting the lid with a groan. Inside, the chest was filled with a jumble of old linens, books, and a pile of yellowed letters, bound together with a fraying ribbon. Imogene's eyes widened as she picked up the bundle of letters. These look like they've been here for a century. Maybe longer, Everett said, watching her closely. Want to take a look? She nodded, untying the ribbon and carefully unfolding one of the letters. Her fingers trembled slightly as she began to read aloud. Dearest C, she started, frowning. The ink smudged, but I think this was written by Patience. Everett leaned in, peering over her shoulder. Looks like it. Her handwriting matches the records I found in the archives. Imogene's voice softened as she continued reading. I fear my brother's anger more with each passing day. He grows colder toward us, and I know he would never approve of our union. If only we could run away. She trailed off, the weight of the words settling over them both. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the quiet of the attic heavy with the past. This was written to her sea captain, Imogene said softly. She must have known her brother would try to stop them. Everett nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. This was more than just a letter. It was a glimpse into the life of a woman whose love had been torn apart. Let's go through the rest, he said, motioning to the other letters. There might be more clues here. Something about where the ring could be. Imogene nodded, carefully placing the first letter back into the chest before pulling out the next one. The two of them sat side by side, working through the letters in silence, the distant past intertwining with their present in ways neither of them could have anticipated. Chapter 3. Imogene sat at the kitchen table, staring at the bundle of letters she and Everett had uncovered in the attic the day before. She hadn't been able to stop thinking about them, the way Patience's words seemed to leap off the page, filled with longing and fear. It felt surreal to be holding pieces of someone's life, someone whose story had been reduced to whispers and legends on the island. Taking another sip of her now lukewarm coffee, she sighed and leaned back in her chair. She wasn't used to this kind of uncertainty, whether it was the mystery of Patience Winthrop or the strange pull she felt toward Everett. Things were simpler in her world of science, where everything had an explanation. But here on Palmar Island, she was beginning to realize that not everything could be neatly categorized or easily dismissed. Deciding she needed some fresh air, Imogene grabbed her bag and headed out. The small center of town was a far cry from the bustling streets of Charleston. Here, the pace was slower, and everyone knew everyone else. It felt both comforting and stifling at the same time, but today, she hoped the familiarity of it would calm the swirling thoughts in her head. As she approached the Roasted Bean, the island's go-to coffee shop, the scent of fresh-baked pastries and brewed coffee filled the air. She didn't really need more caffeine, but the thought of a fresh muffin was too tempting to pass up. Just as she reached for the door, a voice called out from behind her. Imogene, wait up and I'll join you. Turning around, Imogene saw Miss Doris hurrying across the street, a big smile on the elderly woman's face. Her steel gray eyes twinkled, and she was slightly out of breath when she came to a stop. Miss Doris, Imogene said with a smile. It's good to see you again. And you too, my dear, Miss Doris replied. I was just saying to Betty the other day, I wonder when Imogene will stop hiding away in that old house and come out to see the rest of us. Imogene chuckled, opening the door for Miss Doris as they both stepped into the coffee shop. I haven't been hiding, I've been busy. Lots to sort through at Aunt Imogene's place. Miss Doris hummed knowingly as they approached the counter. I'm sure there is. That house is full of history, you know. Your great-aunt kept all kinds of secrets. There are even rumors that she knew where Patience's ring was hidden. Imogene tensed at the mention of Patience. Word traveled fast on the island, but Miss Doris seemed to have an extra sense for these things. She managed a casual response. I doubt she knew anything more than anyone else. It's all just a story. Miss Doris raised an eyebrow. Story or not, people have seen things. Heard things. That ghost of Patience has been wandering the island for years, looking for her lost ring. You don't believe it? Imogene hesitated. I'm not sure. Well, I'm not so sure either, but your Aunt Imogene was convinced of it. Miss Doris leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. And I'm pretty sure Everett believes the ring was hidden in that house somewhere, just waiting to be found. Imogene blinked. He told you that? Not directly, of course, Miss Doris said, waving her hand as if that detail was irrelevant. But he's hinted at it. And Imogene told me more than once that there were things in that house that didn't want to stay buried. Imogene didn't know what to say. She'd already seen enough strange things in the past few days to make her question everything she thought she knew. But Miss Doris' words sent a shiver down her spine. You be careful up there, Imogene, Miss Doris said, patting her arm. I'm glad Everett is by your side. It's good seeing the two of you spending time together. Later that afternoon, Imogene found herself back at the house, her thoughts racing. The conversation with Miss Doris had left her unsettled. She hadn't wanted to believe in any of this ghost stuff, yet here she was, going through letters and looking for a ring that was probably lost a century ago. And the last thing she needed was Palmar Island's notorious matchmaker and busybody getting any ideas about her and Everett. Her phone buzzed beside her. A message from him. Find anything new in those letters? Imogene smiled, her anxiety easing slightly. She texted back, not yet, but I'm working on it. Want to come over later? Be there in an hour, Everett replied. She set her phone down and returned to the letters. She had only read a few of them so far, but they all pointed to the same conclusion. Patience's brother had taken her ring and hidden it, determined to keep her from marrying the man she loved. But none of the letters had mentioned where the ring might be. Imogene thumbed through the papers again, her eyes scanning the fading ink. As much as she hated to admit it, she was beginning to feel a connection to Patience's story. The woman had been trapped by her family, torn between love and duty, and now her spirit was said to roam the island, still searching for the one thing that had been taken from her. Imogene couldn't shake the feeling that, in some strange way, she and Patience weren't so different. A knock on the door pulled her out of her thoughts. Everett stood on the porch, grinning, a notebook tucked under his arm. Ready to get back to it? He asked. More than ready, Imogene said, stepping aside to let him in. They settled back at the kitchen table, the letters spread out in front of them. Everett flipped through his notebook, occasionally glancing at the documents they'd found. This one's interesting, he said, pointing to a particular letter. It mentions a chest. Something Patience's brother put away after he took the ring. Imogene frowned as she picked up the letter. A chest? We found one in the attic, but it didn't seem like much. Maybe we missed something, Everett suggested. Or maybe there's another one somewhere. These old houses always have hidden spaces. Imogene sighed, her skepticism battling with her curiosity. Do you really think the ring could be here? Everett leaned back in his chair, his eyes twinkling. I think it's possible. And I think your great-aunt believed it too. Why else would she have kept all these letters? There's something here, Imogene. We just have to find it. Imogene felt a warmth spread through her as Everett spoke, his eyes holding hers a moment longer than usual. His words weren't just about the mystery, they were about them, a quiet understanding that she hadn't realized she craved. She caught herself smiling, a flutter rising in her chest, the kind that had nothing to do with solving old legends. His gaze made her feel like they were in this together, partners in a way that went beyond finding an old ring. All right, she said, standing up. Let's take another look in the attic. Together, they climbed the stairs. She felt his presence behind her as she stepped into the open space. The old chest they had uncovered sat in the corner, looking as unremarkable as ever. Imogene wondered if there was something they'd missed. Everett crouched down in front of it, running his hand along the edges. There could be a false bottom or hidden compartment, he murmured, sounding more serious than usual. Imogene knelt beside him, watching as he carefully inspected the chest. Do you think? She froze at the sound of a creak in the floorboard behind them, her breath catching in her throat. Everett glanced up, his expression tense. Did you hear that? Imogene whispered. He nodded, standing slowly. It's probably. The floorboard creaked again, louder this time, as if someone was walking toward them. Imogene's heart raced, the logical part of her brain trying to come up with a reason for the noise, but she couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. Everett took a step forward, his body tense. Before he could take another step, the sound stopped. The attic was silent once more. Imogene let out a shaky breath, her pulse still pounding in her ears. This house is going to drive me crazy. Everett chuckled softly, though his voice was a little unsteady. Welcome back to Palmar Island. Chapter 4. So, let me get this straight, Imogene said, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear as the breeze off the ocean ruffled it. You think Patience had her heart broken and has been haunting the island since the day she died? Everett walked alongside Imogene as they made their way to the woman's last resting ground. I know it sounds crazy, Everett said, glancing at her as they walked. But I really think there's more to Patience's story than just a legend. They strolled down the narrow path toward the old churchyard. It wasn't far from her gray tant's house, tucked between the marshes and the edge of the island, where the oak trees stretched overhead like crooked fingers, casting long shadows. Imogene raised an eyebrow, her arms crossed against the cool breeze. You're convinced her ghost is real? Let's say I'm convinced something is real. Everett shot her a grin, nudging her shoulder gently as they walked. Besides, you're starting to come around. Don't deny it. She might not admit it, but she was intrigued. He'd seen it in the way she'd pored over the letters the day before, her brow furrowed in concentration as she tried to piece together Patience's story. And now, they were following another lead, one Everett hoped would bring them closer to the truth. As they strolled side by side, the breeze off the ocean picked up, tangling in Imogene's hair. She crossed her arms, as if to shield herself from the sudden chill. Cold? Everett asked, placing a hand on her back as they walked. He could feel the slight tension in her shoulders ease under his touch, and for a moment, he let his hand linger there, hoping it didn't feel too forward. I'm fine, she said, though she didn't pull away from him. It's been a while since I've been down here. I forgot how peaceful it is. That's the thing about this place, Everett said quietly. It gets into your bones. No matter how long you're gone, it's always waiting for you. Imogene glanced up at him, her expression softening. You always did love this island more than anyone I knew. I can see why you never left. I couldn't, Everett admitted, his hand still resting lightly on her back as they walked. It's not just the island, though. It's the history. The stories. Everything that came before us. It's a part of me. History, ghosts, and legends, she said, a playful smile tugging at her lips. You're a true romantic, aren't you? Maybe. He looked more closely at her. Imogene's hair had blown loose again, framing her face, and he resisted the urge to reach out and tuck it behind her ear. Or maybe I like the idea that some things are worth holding on to. Imogene's steps slowed, and Everett felt the shift in the air between them. She turned toward him, her eyes searching his. And you think Patience's story is one of those things? Something worth holding on to? He nodded, his voice dropping to a softer tone. I do. I think it's more than just a ghost story. It's about love and loss. About the things that make us who we are. The old churchyard came into view, its wrought iron gate rusted and overgrown with ivy. Beyond it, the small cemetery stretched out, rows of headstones worn down by time and weather. In the far corner, under the shade of a massive oak, lay Patience Winthrop's grave. Here we are, Everett said, stopping just inside the gate. He could feel the shift in the air as they crossed into the cemetery, the weight of the past pressing down on them. Patience was buried here, next to her family. Imogene followed him, looking at the worn headstones as they walked. When they reached Patience's grave, Everett knelt down, brushing away the fallen leaves that had gathered around the base of the headstone. Look at this, Everett said, pointing to the weathered inscription. It was faint, nearly illegible, but as Imogene crouched down beside him, she could just make out the words, "To my dearest Peda, our love, eternal, though the ring lost." Imogene frowned, running her fingers over the faded letters. That's strange. Exactly, Everett said. The ring is mentioned here, which means the sea captain knew it was lost, or taken. Imogene's eyes widened as she connected the dots. You think the captain had this engraved? Everett nodded. It's possible. Her brother took the ring, but the captain might have known about it. Perhaps this was his way of speaking to her, of holding on to hope that their love would endure, even without the ring. Like a message left for her, and for anyone who knew their story, Imogene murmured, her gaze softening as she looked at the inscription. He must have loved her deeply to immortalize their love like this, despite the loss. Everett looked at her, a rush of excitement coursing through him. Exactly. And if that's true, it suggests he knew more about the circumstances around the ring. Imogene stood, squaring her shoulders. Then we need to find out more about him. If he knew the ring was taken, he might have tried to find it, or at least left clues that could lead us to it. It's possible. He looked off into the distance, wishing he could feel as confident as she looked. There isn't a lot of information out there about the captain. I've looked. But that doesn't mean we're going to give up. The ring is out there, he said with conviction. Imogene stood, her gaze lingering on the headstone. You really think we'll find it? I think it's worth looking, Everett replied, rising to his feet. You're more involved in this than you think, Imogene. Patience's story is closer to you than you realize. She glanced up at him, and for a moment, neither of them moved, the wind rustling through the trees, carrying with it the distant crash of waves. The air felt heavy with possibility, like the island itself was holding its breath, waiting. Let's keep moving, Imogene said, breaking the silence. They walked back toward the house, their conversation shifting from Patience's story to lighter topics, Imogene's life in Charleston, his work on the island, memories of summers spent together when they were young. The day stretched on, and the tension that had built between them earlier started to ease, replaced by the easy rhythm of familiarity. But beneath it all, Everett could still feel that spark, the one he hadn't been able to shake since she came back. By the time they reached the old house, the sky had darkened, the first stars flickering to life overhead. Inside, the kitchen was warm and dimly lit, the letters they'd been studying earlier still spread out across the table. I'm going to take another look at these, Imogene said, nodding toward the pile of letters. Go ahead, Everett said, leaning against the counter, watching as she sat down and began flipping through the papers again. Her brow furrowed in concentration, the same way it always did when she was deep in thought. For a while, they worked in silence, the soft rustle of paper the only sound in the room. But as the minutes passed, Everett felt himself growing more aware of her, of the way her fingers moved over the pages, the way her hair caught the light as she leaned forward. He wasn't sure when it happened, but somewhere along the way, his thoughts had shifted from the mystery of Patience's lost ring to the woman sitting across from him. I think this one's important, Imogene said, breaking the silence as she held up a particularly worn letter. It mentions something about the sea captain. About their last meeting before her brother intervened. Everett moved closer, leaning over her shoulder, to get a better look. His hand brushed against hers. She looked up, their faces only inches apart, and Everett's heart stuttered. The earlier warmth returned, filling the space between them. Imogene's eyes flickered to his lips. He felt the pull, the unspoken question hanging between them. He leaned in when a sudden gust of wind swept through the room, blowing the loose papers off the table. The temperature dropped, and a low, almost imperceptible whisper echoed through the air, "Where is it?" Everett froze, his hand resting on Imogene's. The room had gone cold, the kind of chill that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. He looked at Imogene, her wide eyes mirroring his own. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely audible. He nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. "I did." Neither of them moved. The room felt small, charged with something he couldn't explain. The warmth of Imogene's hand beneath his was a lifeline, grounding him in the face of the inexplicable. Finally, Imogene pulled away, her voice shaky. "It was patience, wasn't it?" "I think so." Everett didn't know what else to say. Imogene stood, wrapping her arms around herself as she paced the length of the kitchen. "I don't understand. How is this happening?" Everett took a deep breath, trying to steady his own racing heart. "I don't know. But whatever it is, it's real." Chapter 5. Imogene stood at the window, staring out into the stillness of the island, her thoughts tangled in knots she couldn't seem to untie. The events of the previous night played on a loop in her mind: Patience's whispered voice, the sudden drop in temperature, the moment with Everett. She'd been sure he was about to kiss her. She pressed her hand against the cool glass, her reflection staring back at her. This wasn't who she was. She was logical, grounded, someone who found comfort in facts and science. But none of this, Patience's ghost, the strange connection she felt to the island's past, the way Everett made her feel, could be explained away with reason. A loud knock startled her. She turned and hesitated before heading downstairs to open the door. "You didn't think I'd let you get away with hiding out up here, did you?" Miss Doris asked, raising an eyebrow. The island's unofficial matchmaker held a basket of fresh muffins. Imogene sighed but smiled, stepping aside to let her in. "You know me too well." "I know everyone too well, dear," Miss Doris said with a grin. "Now, let's sit down. You look like you've seen a ghost." Imogene froze at the comment, her heart thudding in her chest. "I'm fine," she said, brushing her hair behind her ear as she followed Miss Doris into the kitchen. "Just tired." Miss Doris set the basket on the table, her sharp eyes never leaving Imogene. "Tired or troubled?" Imogene sat down, unsure how to answer. "Both, I guess." "Well," Miss Doris said, sliding into the chair across from her, "why don't you tell me what's been troubling you? I may not have all the answers, but I've got enough stories to distract you for a while." Imogene forced a faint smile, grateful for the offer, but she wasn't sure she wanted to distract herself. She wanted answers. "Things have been strange," Imogene said, not sure where to start. "Since I came back, I've been having these dreams. Dreams about Patience. I keep seeing her weeping and searching for something." Miss Doris nodded, her expression unreadable. "The ring." Imogene swallowed. "Yes. I keep seeing it. And last night, she stopped, gathering her thoughts. "I heard her voice. She was calling out, asking, 'Where is it?' It was real, Miss Doris. I don't know how, but it was." Miss Doris's gaze softened. "It doesn't surprise me, dear. I've heard enough stories about Patience's ghost to know that she's restless. What surprises me is that you're feeling it so deeply." Imogene looked down at her hands, her fingers twisting nervously in her lap. "I don't want to believe in any of this," she admitted. "But it's getting harder to explain away." "Some things don't need explaining," Miss Doris said gently. "Some things just are." Imogene shook her head, her frustration building. "But that's not who I am. I can't just accept something without proof. That's why I went into science, why I left the island in the first place. I wanted answers, real answers." Miss Doris reached across the table, her weathered hand resting on top of Imogene's. "You can't explain everything. Least of all the matters of the heart." Imogene looked up, startled by the turn in the conversation. "What do you mean?" Miss Doris smiled, a knowing glint in her eye. "I mean Everett. You don't need me to tell you there's something between the two of you." Imogene felt her cheeks heat, the mention of Everett making her pulse quicken. "It's complicated." Of course it is, Miss Doris said with a wave of her hand. Love always is. But you're making it more complicated than it needs to be. Imogene swallowed hard, her mind flashing back to the moment in the kitchen when she and Everett had been so close to kissing. She had wanted to kiss him. Desperately. But just as the air had grown thick with unspoken feelings, Patience's voice had shattered the moment. He cares about you, Miss Doris said, her voice gentle. And you care about him. What's holding you back? Imogene's chest tightened. I don't know. It was a lie. She knew exactly what was holding her back. She had opened her heart before, to someone who had seemed perfect on paper, until it had all fallen apart. Her last relationship had been a disaster, the kind that left her questioning everything she thought she knew about love and trust. And now, standing on the edge of something real with Everett, she was terrified of falling again. Miss Doris gave her hand a comforting squeeze. You can't let the past keep you from the future, Imogene. Don't let what happened before stop you from what's right in front of you. Imogene bit her lip. Was that what she was doing? Was she pushing Everett away because she was too scared to take the risk? I'll think about it. Miss Doris smiled. Good. Now, let's talk about something more pleasant. You've been in this old house too long. You need a break. Imogene tossed and turned that night, her mind refusing to calm. The words Miss Doris had spoken echoed in her ears, but so did Patience's voice, that haunting whisper asking, "Where is it?" Finally, she drifted off, the exhaustion from the past few days catching up with her. But her dreams were anything but restful. In the dream, she was standing in the same old churchyard she had visited with Everett, the trees casting long shadows over the graves. The air was thick with fog, swirling around her feet as she moved forward, drawn by an invisible force. At the far end of the cemetery, Patience was waiting. She stood beside her grave, her face pale and streaked with tears, her hand clutching a delicate gold ring. Her lips moved, but no sound came out, only that same question, over and over again. Where is it? Imogene tried to speak, to tell her she didn't know, but the words wouldn't come. All she could do was watch as Patience sank to her knees, weeping, the ring slipping from her fingers and disappearing into the earth. Imogene jolted awake, her heart pounding. She blinked in the darkness, trying to slow her breathing, but something was wrong. She wasn't in bed. She was standing in front of her gray-tance old mirror, her reflection staring back at her, wide-eyed and confused. How? She whispered, her voice trembling. She had no memory of getting out of bed, no recollection of moving across the room. But here she was, standing in the dark, her hand outstretched toward the mirror. Imogene took a step back, her mind racing. This wasn't just a dream. She turned and hurried back to bed, her pulse still racing. Even as she pulled the covers around her, her mind refused to calm. And when she closed her eyes, she could still see Patience, still hear that haunting question. Later that night, Imogene woke again, this time to the unmistakable sensation that she wasn't alone. She sat up slowly, her breath catching in her throat as her eyes adjusted to the darkness. Imogene froze, her heart hammering in her chest. Patience stood at the foot of her bed. Her figure was faint, almost translucent. She stood still, her eyes fixed on Imogene, her expression heavy with sadness. The room was deathly silent, the air thick with the weight of the past. The ghost wasn't just a story. She was real. And she was here, searching for something Imogene didn't know how to give her. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Patience's figure began to fade, slowly dissolving into the darkness until she was gone. Imogene sat in stunned silence, her hands trembling, her heart racing. Chapter 6. Everett sat at his kitchen table, staring at the pile of old documents spread out before him. The house was quiet, the only sound the steady ticking of the clock on the wall. Normally, the quiet helped him focus, especially when he was deep into research, but today, his mind was anything but calm. He couldn't stop thinking about her. Imogene. The one that got away before he'd gotten up the nerve to ask her out. The moment they'd shared kept replaying in his head, a loop he couldn't escape. Time and again, he imagined what it would be like to feel her soft lips, to taste her, to have her press her warm body against his. And it was more than that. The way she'd changed since coming back to the island, the way she was starting to believe in the legend of Patience Winthrop, even if she wouldn't admit it. And most of all, the way she was fighting her feelings for him, holding back when everything told him they were meant to be. He sighed, leaning back in his chair and rubbing a hand over his face. He'd spent the last few days combing through every piece of research he could find about Patience Winthrop, convinced that solving the mystery of the missing ring was the key to helping both Patience's ghost and Imogene find peace. But the deeper he dug, the more it felt like they were running in circles, chasing a ghost that refused to give them the answers they needed. And then there was Imogene herself. She was still resisting, still trying to explain away everything they'd experienced, even though he could see in her eyes that she was starting to believe. It frustrated him, but more than that, it hurt. Because the more she pushed away the idea of the ghost, the more she seemed to be pushing him away too. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. It was Imogene, looking as conflicted as he felt. Her hair was loose around her shoulders, her eyes shadowed with something he couldn't quite place. "Can I come in?" she asked. "Of course," Everett said, stepping aside to let her in. She brushed past him into the living room that served as his study. Imogene didn't sit. She stood by the window, arms crossed, staring out at the fading light. "I need to talk to you about something." Everett's stomach tightened. "What's going on?" She was silent for a long moment, her back to him. When she spoke, her voice was low. "I had another dream about Patience." He moved closer, standing behind her. "What happened?" Imogene turned to face him, and he could see the strain in her expression, the way her fingers gripped her arms a little too tightly. "It was more than a dream, Everett. She was there. Standing at the foot of my bed. I saw her. And I know what you're going to say, but I don't know what to believe anymore. I've spent my whole life relying on logic and facts, and now I'm standing here, telling you I saw a ghost." Everett reached out, resting a hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to explain it. I believe you." She pulled away, pacing across the room. "That's the problem. You believe in all of this, the ghost, the ring, everything. And I want to, but..." She stopped, turning to look at him, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "I'm scared." Everett's chest tightened. "Of what?" "Of repeating the past," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Patience's story. It's like a warning. She loved someone, and it all went wrong. She lost everything. What if that's what's happening to us? To me? What if we're following the same path?" Everett took a step closer to her, his hands clenching at his sides. "Imogene, we're not Patience and her sea captain. This isn't her story. It's ours. And yes, it's scary. Love is scary. But that doesn't mean it's doomed to end the same way." Imogene shook her head, backing away from him. "I trusted someone, I loved him, and it all fell apart. I don't think I can do that again." The words hit him harder than he expected. He felt the distance growing between them, the walls she was building to protect herself, and he didn't know how to tear them down. "I get it," he said, his voice quieter now. "You've been hurt. But I'm not him. I'm not going to do that to you." Imogene's eyes softened for a brief moment, but then she looked away, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. "You say that now. Things change. People change. I can't take the risk. Not with you." Everett stared at her, the weight of her words sinking in. He'd waited for her for so long, hoping that one day she'd see what was right in front of her, but now he wasn't sure if she ever would. "I've always cared about you, Imogene," he said, struggling to get the words out. "Since we were kids. And I've waited. But I'm not going to keep waiting if you don't want me to." Imogene's breath hitched, and he could see the conflict in her eyes, the part of her that wanted to let him in battling against the part of her that was too afraid. "I don't want you to." He took a deep breath, stepping back. "Okay then. silence fell between them, heavy and suffocating. Imogene stood frozen, her expression unreadable, and Everett felt a sharp ache in his chest. He'd tried. He'd given her everything he had, and it still wasn't enough. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice barely audible. Everett swallowed the lump in his throat, nodding. "Me too." Without another word, she turned and walked out the door, pulling it shut behind her with a loud thud that reverberated through his home. Chapter 7. The house was too quiet. Imogene sat at the kitchen table, staring at the pile of letters from the attic. The papers were neatly stacked, untouched since her argument with Everett, if you could call it that. His absence lingered in the air, a heavy weight that made the already chilly house feel even colder. She wasn't sure what she'd expected when she'd rushed to his place 3 days ago. She had pushed him away, just like she'd been pushing everything else away since she came back to Palmar Island, the ghost, her feelings for Everett. She thought she'd been protecting herself, but now, sitting alone in the silence, she wondered if all she'd been doing was building walls. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, and Imogene shivered. She pulled her cardigan tighter around herself. It did little to stop the cold from seeping into her bones. In the past few days, the house had felt more oppressive. Patience's ghost was no longer a distant presence, she was everywhere. Imogene had seen her several times, a pale figure standing at the edge of the room, always watching, always waiting. And the weeping, it had become more frequent, haunting Imogene at all hours of the night, the mournful sobs filling the silence like a terrible lullaby. Imogene wanted to believe she could still rationalize it, that the cold air and flickering lights were the quirks of an old house. Drafts she could blame on old windows and door frames that had settled over the centuries. But deep down, she knew better. Patience was here, and she wasn't going away until Imogene faced whatever it was the young woman was trying to show her. Imogene glanced at the clock. It was late, but sleep had been elusive since she'd pushed Everett away. The memory of their conversation still gnawed at her. Hurting him was the last thing she'd wanted to do, but her own fear had come between them. Imogene pushed back from the table, heading toward the stairs. Maybe sleep would come tonight, sweet oblivion from the weight pressing down on her. At least for a little while. The dream came quickly, pulling Imogene into a world that felt oddly familiar. She stood in a dimly lit room, the air heavy with tension and an old, unspoken sadness. The wallpaper was faded, the furniture worn and covered in dust, as though the room had been abandoned long ago. But Patience was there, her figure more solid than it had ever been before. Her dark hair hung in loose waves over her pale shoulders, and she stood at the center of the room, her face streaked with tears, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. Imogene's breath caught as she watched Patience, the woman whose story had haunted her dreams, whose love had been stolen. She wanted to speak, to ask her what was happening, but before she could, the door to the room swung open, and a man entered. He was tall, with the same dark hair as Patience, his features sharp and angry, her brother. Imogene watched, unable to move, as the brother crossed the room in long strides. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small velvet box, the ring. Imogene's heart raced as she saw it, the gold band glinting in the dim light when he opened the box. Patience's eyes widened, her hands trembling as she reached for the ring, desperation evident in her every movement. But before she could touch it, her brother snatched it away, his expression cold and unyielding. "You will never marry him," he said, his voice low and cruel. "He is far below your standing. I will never give my permission. Forget about him." Patience shook her head, her tears flowing freely now. "Please, I love him." Her brother sneered, turning his back on her as he tucked the ring back into his pocket. "Love is a weakness, Patience. You will do as you are told." Imogene's heart broke for the woman standing before her. She wanted to scream, to reach out and stop what was happening, but she was powerless, trapped in the dream as an observer. "I'll never stop loving him," Patience cried, her voice cracking with the weight of her grief. "No matter what you take from me." Her brother left the room, the door slamming shut behind him. And with that, Patience collapsed to the floor, her sobs filling the room, her shoulders shaking with the force of her grief. Imogene knelt beside her, reaching out instinctively. But there was nothing. Her fingers passed through Patience's form, touching only cold air. Patience couldn't see her, couldn't hear her. She was locked in her own moment of despair, and Imogene was helpless to stop it. Patience, Imogene whispered, the name a soft plea, though she knew it was useless. And yet, to her shock, Patience stilled. Slowly, she lifted her head, her tear-filled eyes locking onto Imogene's. "You can see me," Patience whispered, her voice trembling with disbelief. "You're here." Imogene blinked in surprise. "You can hear me?" Patience nodded slowly, rising to her feet, her ghostly form flickering slightly as she wiped the tears from her cheeks. "You're not just a dream. You're, like me. We're connected." Imogene swallowed, her heart pounding. "How? How are we connected?" Patience took a shaky breath. "You are my blood. My family. You come from my line, long after my brother buried me and our story. You are the hope I clung to in my final days, the hope that someone would remember, someone would fight for the love I lost." Imogene stared at her, the weight of Patience's words sinking in. "I'm your descendant?" Patience nodded, a sad smile playing on her lips. "Indirectly, yes. The ring, the house, all of it passed through our family, even though my story was hidden in whispers and shadows. You are the one who was meant to find the truth. You're the one who can set things right." Imogene's throat tightened, the gravity of her connection to Patience hitting her full force. "I didn't know. I didn't realize." "You couldn't have known," Patience said softly. "But now you do. And you must understand, Imogene, my story wasn't about tragedy. It wasn't about loss. It was about love. Love that endured even when everything was taken from me." Imogene frowned, her chest aching. "But you lost him. Your brother, he took the ring, and you never got to marry the man you loved." Patience's gaze softened, and she reached out, her ghostly hand brushing the air near Imogene's. "He took the ring. But he couldn't take the love. The ring was only a symbol, what mattered was the love itself. That was what survived. That's why I fought, why I stayed." Imogene felt tears prick her eyes. "You stayed because you believed the love was still there?" Patience nodded. "Love is always worth fighting for, Imogene. Even if it's hard, even if it scares you. The man I loved, he knew that. He knew our love would outlast everything. That's why he had the inscription engraved on my tomb. He wanted me to know, our love was eternal, despite all." Imogene's breath caught as she remembered the words etched into the gravestone, "To my dearest P. Our love, eternal, though the ring lost." "I've been so focused on the tragedy," Imogene whispered. "I thought your story was a warning. But you're saying, it's not." Patience's expression softened, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and hope. "No, Imogene. My story is a reminder. A reminder that love is worth every risk. Don't let fear keep you from the one you love. Don't let my brother's cruelty define my legacy." Imogene wiped away a tear, her heart swelling with emotion. She had been so afraid of repeating Patience's fate, of losing everything if she dared to love again. But now she saw it clearly. Patience wasn't searching for the ring because it represented tragedy. She was searching for it because it represented hope. The hope that love could still be found. That it wasn't too late. "I won't make the same mistake," Imogene said, her voice steady. "I'll fight for what I love." Patience's smile widened, and for the first time, she looked truly at peace. "Then my story has served its purpose." Imogene reached out, this time feeling a faint warmth as her fingers brushed the edge of Patience's hand. "Thank you." Patience nodded, her form beginning to fade. "Remember, Imogene, love is eternal, despite all." Imogene jolted awake, her heart pounding in her chest. The room was dark, but her eyes quickly adjusted, taking in the familiar surroundings of her Greytant's house. Except something wasn't right. She wasn't in bed. Imogene blinked, her breath catching in her throat as she realized she was standing in front of her grey-tance mirror, again. Her reflection stared back at her, wide-eyed and disoriented, just like the last time. This time, her hand was raised as if reaching for something that wasn't there. What did it mean? Imogene's pulse quickened, her thoughts racing. She had been pushing Everett away because she was scared of getting hurt, of repeating the mistakes of her past. But Patience's story wasn't a warning, it was a reminder that love wasn't something to be feared. It was something to be fought for, something worth holding on to. She couldn't let her fear control her anymore. Not when there was so much at stake. Imogene turned away from the mirror, her heart still racing, but for a different reason now. She couldn't let Everett go. She couldn't let this island, this mystery, this chance slip through her fingers. She had made her decision. She was going to solve the mystery of Patience's ring, not just for the ghost, but for herself. Chapter 8. Everett paced the length of his living room, glancing every few seconds at the clock on the wall. The early morning sun streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the room, but he couldn't seem to find any comfort in the usual quiet of the island. His mind kept replaying the last conversation he had with Imogene, the way her voice had wavered when she told him she wasn't ready, the way she had walked away, and the heavy disappointment that lingered afterward. He hadn't been able to focus since then, no matter how many times he tried to throw himself into his research. Every letter, every document reminded him of her. It was frustrating, knowing that even after all these years of waiting, he still couldn't seem to let go. But he wasn't going to chase after her. Not anymore. If she wanted him, she would have to make that decision on her own. A knock on the door broke through his thoughts. Imogene stood on the other side, looking as if she hadn't slept much since the last time they'd spoken. Her eyes were shadowed with fatigue, but there was a determination in her expression that Everett hadn't seen before. "Hey," she said softly, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Can we talk?" Everett hesitated for a split second before stepping aside. "Of course." She walked in slowly, her movements uncertain, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of their last conversation still lingered between them, thick and uncomfortable. Everett leaned against the kitchen counter, crossing his arms, waiting for her to say what she needed to say. "I owe you an apology," Imogene began, her voice steady, despite the obvious tension in her shoulders. "I pushed you away because I was scared. Not because I didn't want to be with you, but because I was afraid of getting hurt again." Everett watched her closely, his heart pounding. She was opening up in a way he hadn't expected, and part of him was afraid to believe it was real. There was something different about her now, something raw and honest that hadn't been there before. "I had another dream." Imogene's eyes flickered up to meet his. "About Patience. This time, she showed me everything, how her brother took the ring, how she fought for the man she loved. And I realized something. I'd been so focused on the tragedy of her story, on the fear of losing someone again, that I didn't see what she was really trying to show me." Everett frowned, stepping closer. "What do you mean?" Imogene swallowed hard. "The ring. It wasn't about loss. It was about love. She didn't stop loving him, even after everything went wrong. I've been pushing you away because I'm scared of losing what we have before we even give it a chance." Her words hung in the air between them, and Everett felt his chest tighten. She wasn't just talking about the ghost anymore, she was talking about them. "I'm sorry," Imogene said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't want to hurt you. But I don't want to run anymore. I want to stay. Here. With you." Everett let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding, the tension in his body melting away. He stepped closer, reaching for her hand, his fingers brushing against hers. "You don't have to apologize," he said quietly. "I get it. I do. And I'm not going to push you into anything you're not ready for." Imogene looked up at him, her eyes filled with a vulnerability that took his breath away. "I'm ready now." The words hit him like a wave, and for a moment, he didn't know how to respond. Slowly, he slid his hand up her arm, resting it on her shoulder. I've waited a long time to hear you say that, he whispered. A soft smile tugged at her lips, and Everett felt the last of the tension between them dissolve. He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers, the warmth of her presence grounding him in a way nothing else could. I want to solve this mystery, Imogene said after a moment, her breath warm against his skin. Not just for Patience, but for us. I think finding the ring will help her move on. And maybe it'll help us move forward too. Everett pulled back slightly, nodding. I think it's all connected somehow. He reached for the stack of letters on the table, his fingers brushing the familiar papers they'd been poring over for days. Let's go through these one more time. I have a feeling we've missed something. They sat down together, the letters spread out between them, their shoulders brushing as they worked. The atmosphere in the room had shifted, the tension from before replaced by quiet determination. Everett could feel the attraction between them, the way their hands occasionally touched as they passed papers back and forth, the subtle glances exchanged when they found something that piqued their interest. This one, Imogene said, her voice cutting through the silence. She held up a letter, her eyes scanning the faded ink. It's from her brother. He's writing about something he took from her, something he hid. Everett leaned in. What does it say? Imogene's brow furrowed as she read aloud. The house is ours now, and the ring is gone. Hidden where it will never be found, among the things she cherished most. Everett's pulse quickened. Among the things she cherished most. That has to be a clue. What did Patience cherish? Imogene sat back, thinking for a moment. She didn't have much. Her family was wealthy, but from everything we've read, Patience wasn't materialistic. She cherished people, relationships. Her sea captain, her mother, and maybe her brother, once upon a time. Everett's eyes lit up. Her mother, or someone else close to her. Didn't your great-aunt wear a locket? She always had it on, didn't she? Imogene's heart skipped a beat. Yes. That locket was passed down in the family. Everett leaned forward, clearly excited by the possibility. That could be it. Your great-aunt was a descendant of Patience's family. If Patience's brother took the ring and it stayed in the family, it could have been passed down through generations, eventually ending up with your great-aunt. She might not have known the full story, but she cherished it enough to keep it close. Imogene nodded slowly, the pieces clicking into place. It makes sense. My great-aunt never talked about it, but she always treated that locket like it was more than just a piece of jewelry. She must have known it was important. Everett sat up straighter. It's possible the ring was hidden in it all along, and no one ever knew. Imogene nodded. We need to find that locket. It could be the final piece of the puzzle. Everett reached for her hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. Then let's do it. Together. Slowly, Everett slid his hand through hers, pulling her closer. This time, there was no ghost to stop them. No fear holding them back. Imogene leaned in, her lips brushing against his, and Everett felt the world fall away. In that moment, nothing else mattered but her, the woman he'd waited for all these years. Chapter 9. Imogene stood at the weathered dresser in her gray-tant's bedroom, her fingers trembling as she lifted the delicate silver locket from the velvet-lined box. The room was quiet, save for the low hum of the wind outside, carrying with it the salt and stillness of Palmar Island. Beside her, Everett watched silently, his eyes focused on the locket. The antique piece of jewelry had been a constant, something her great-aunt Imogene wore every day without fail. And yet, in all the time she had spent visiting this house, Imogene had never once thought to ask about its origin, never imagined it might hold something more than sentimental value. With a deep breath, she clicked open the tiny clasp and pried the locket apart. Inside, nestled in a small, hidden compartment, was a ring. Imogene gasped softly, her heart racing. The ring was simple but beautiful, a thin gold band, its surface worn with age, and a delicate engraving she could just barely make out. Eternal, despite all, she read, her finger tracing the words. A fitting message, don't you think? Everett said, moving closer. This is it, she whispered, turning the ring over in her hand. Patience's ring. His hand rested lightly on her shoulder as he peered at the ring. We found it, he said quietly, his voice filled with awe. After all this time. Imogene nodded, her mind spinning as she thought about everything that had led them to this moment. The dreams, the letters, the ghostly encounters, they had all pointed to this. And now, standing here with the ring in her hand, she could feel the weight of Patience's story pressing down on her. I think we need to take it to her grave, she said. It's the only way to give her peace. Everett met her gaze. I think you're right. The walk to the old churchyard felt longer than usual, the weight of what they were about to do heavy in the air. The late afternoon sun was sinking low on the horizon, casting long shadows over the island. As they reached the wrought iron gate of the cemetery, Imogene's heart quickened. They made their way through the rows of headstones, past the markers of Palmar Island's founding families, until they reached the familiar spot at the far end, Patience Winthrop's resting place, shaded beneath a sprawling oak tree covered in Spanish moss. Imogene stopped in front of the grave, her breath catching as she looked down at the worn stone, the faint inscription that had once seemed like a riddle now clear in its meaning. To my dearest P. Our love, eternal, though the ring lost. Imogene knelt down, her hands trembling as she carefully placed the ring at the base of the headstone. She felt Everett's presence beside her, steady and sure, his hand brushing against hers as they both watched in silence. For a long moment, nothing happened. The air was still, the only sound the gentle rustle of leaves overhead. Then, a faint chill swept through the cemetery, and Imogene's breath hitched. She glanced up, her eyes widening as the familiar figure of Patience's ghost appeared before them, her pale form shimmering in the fading light. But this time, there was no weeping, no sadness in her expression. Instead, Patience looked peaceful, her gaze soft as she looked down at the ring. Just as Imogene began to breathe again, a new presence materialized beside Patience. It was a man, his form more solid than Patience's, though still translucent. He stood tall, his shoulders broad, and his posture commanding, exuding the air of a man who had spent years at sea. His face was strong and weathered, with deep-set eyes that spoke of a life filled with both hardship and adventure. His dark hair, slightly unruly from the sea breeze, fell to his collar. He was dressed in a long, dark naval coat, its brass buttons catching the moonlight. A white shirt with a high collar peeked out from beneath the coat, and a cravat was tied neatly at his throat. He wore high boots, worn but polished, and a tricorn hat sat perched atop his head, completing his dignified appearance. Patience turned, her eyes lighting up as they settled on the man. Her lips parted, and for the first time, her expression filled with joy. Christopher, she breathed. The captain reached out to her, his eyes softening as they met hers. I've been waiting for you, my love, he replied, his voice deep and resonant, carrying the hint of an accent that had faded with time. Imogene and Everett stood frozen, watching as Patience moved toward Christopher. He took her hands in his, and the air around them seemed to shimmer, the cold dissipating as warmth and light enveloped the two figures. Thank you, Patience whispered, turning her gaze briefly to Imogene and Everett, her eyes filled with gratitude. Then, she looked back at Christopher, a radiant smile spreading across her face. I'm ready now. Christopher nodded, his gaze never leaving hers. Then let us go together. Slowly, their forms began to fade, their hands still entwined as they disappeared into the soft glow of the moonlight. And for the first time in centuries, the cemetery was truly silent. Imogene felt a tear slip down her cheek as the last traces of their figures vanished. The ghost that had haunted Palmar Island for so long was finally at peace, her story complete, and now reunited with the man she had loved. Imogene wiped her eyes, her heart swelling with emotion. She's gone, she whispered, her voice catching in her throat. Everett nodded, his hand finding hers. She is. You did it, Imogene. You gave her peace. Imogene looked up at him, her chest tightening with emotion. We did it, she said softly. I couldn't have done this without you. Everett smiled, and the warmth in his eyes sent a surge of something powerful through her. In that moment, standing in the quiet of the churchyard, Imogene felt a profound sense of closure, not just for Patience, but for herself. There was no more fear, no more hesitation. The doubts she once had about love had fallen away, leaving only certainty in their place. Patience's story wasn't one of loss, it was one of enduring love, even when faced with impossible odds. And now, standing here with Everett, Imogene knew that their love, too, was worth holding on to. They had already faced the ghosts of the past, and together, they were ready to embrace the future. She turned to Everett, her heart steady now, a quiet resolve filling her. "I've spent so long being afraid of what might happen. But I'm done running. I want to face whatever comes, and I want to face it with you." Everett's eyes softened, and he stepped closer, his hand lifting to brush a strand of hair away from her face. "You don't have to face anything alone," he said gently. "We'll do it together, whatever comes." Imogene felt her breath catch, the pull between them undeniable. Slowly, she closed the distance between them, her heart soaring as their lips met in a soft, tender kiss. This kiss felt different, it wasn't rushed or urgent. It was steady, filled with a deep, unspoken promise. They weren't just starting something new, they were building something lasting. When they finally pulled apart, Everett smiled down at her, his hand still resting lightly on her cheek. "There's a lot we'll have to figure out," he said softly, his thumb brushing against her skin. Imogene nodded, a smile tugging at her lips. "I know. But we'll figure it out together." As they stood there, hand in hand, the quiet settling around them, Imogene felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: peace. Real, lasting peace. With the past behind them and the future stretched out before them, she was no longer afraid of what might come next. With Everett by her side, she knew they could face anything. Together. Epilogue. Palmar Island, 3 months later. The sky was painted with streaks of gold and pink as the sun began to set over the horizon. The gentle crash of the waves on the shore provided a soothing rhythm, and the cool ocean breeze played with Imogene's hair as they walked along the beach, hand in hand. Much had changed since they'd found the ring and laid Patience's story to rest. The shift in the atmosphere at the house was palpable, lighter, almost peaceful, as if the weight of the past had finally lifted. Imogene had settled into her new life on Palmar Island, and for the first time in as long as Everett could remember, everything felt right. Imogene squeezed his hand, and Everett glanced over at her, smiling. She looked different, more at ease, more herself. The wall she had put up between them had crumbled, and they had spent the last few months rebuilding something new. Something real. "I'm glad I stayed," Imogene said, as if she had read his thoughts. "It's strange. I always thought of this island as a place to visit, a place filled with memories. But now, it feels like home." Everett stopped walking, turning to face her fully. "That's because it is home. For both of us." Imogene's smile widened, her eyes shimmering in the soft glow of the sunset. "You're right." He pulled her closer, wrapping his arms around her waist, their feet sinking into the sand. The moment felt perfect, like the kind of calm after a storm that he hadn't realized he needed. For weeks, he had been turning this over in his mind, wondering if the time was right. But now, standing here with her, there was no doubt left. He wasn't going to waste any more time. "Imogene," Everett began, his voice low and steady, "there's something I've been thinking about." Imogene tilted her head slightly, her brow furrowing with curiosity. "What's that?" He pulled away just enough to reach into his pocket, his fingers brushing against the small box he had been carrying with him. "I've waited a long time to have you in my life," Everett said. "And I don't want to wait any longer to make sure we spend the rest of our lives together." Imogene's eyes widened as he dropped to one knee, pulling the small box from his pocket. Her soft gasp sent a surge of warmth through him. "Everett," she whispered, her voice catching in her throat. He opened the box, revealing the simple diamond ring he'd chosen, the sunset reflecting off the polished surface. "Imogene Calloway, will you marry me?" For a moment, she didn't move. Her eyes locked on his, and he could see the full weight of what he was asking settle in. Then, her face broke into the most beautiful smile he had ever seen. "Yes," she whispered, her voice full of emotion. "Yes, Everett, I will." Everett's heart soared as he slid the ring onto her finger, rising to his feet and pulling her into his arms. The kiss they shared was soft, full of promise, a new beginning, for both of them. When they finally pulled apart, Imogene rested her forehead against his, her laughter mixing with the sound of the waves. "I can't believe you just proposed on the beach at sunset." "That's a little cliché, don't you think?" Everett grinned, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I figured I'd lean into the romance. After everything we've been through, I think we deserve a cliché or two." She laughed, her hand resting on his chest. "I guess we do." They stood there for a while, the beach stretching out before them, the sun slipping below the horizon. Everything felt peaceful, like the island itself had been waiting for this moment. "I'm glad we didn't wait," Imogene said softly, her eyes flicking down to the ring on her finger. "I don't want to waste any more time either." Everett kissed her temple, his heart swelling with love for the woman beside him. "We've got all the time in the world now." Imogene leaned into him, her hand slipping back into his as they began walking again, their steps in perfect rhythm. The future stretched out before them, no longer shadowed by the past or haunted by lingering fears. They had solved the mystery, laid the ghosts to rest, and now, they had found each other. Bonus epilogue. Palmar Island, 1 year later. Imogene Calloway stood in front of the mirror in her grey tant's room, the same room that had once been haunted by memories of the past and the presence of Patience's ghost. Now, it was filled with warmth, light, and laughter. The lingering specter of old tragedies was long gone, replaced by the promise of new beginnings. And a wedding. Her wedding. Imogene smoothed her hand over the lace bodice of her white gown, taking a deep breath as she tried to process the emotion swirling inside her. Today was the day she would marry Everett Beauregard, the man who had become her partner in every sense of the word, the man who had stood by her through mysteries, heartache, and everything in between. "Are you nervous, sweetheart?" came a familiar voice from the doorway. Imogene turned to see her mother, Eleanor, standing with a soft smile, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. She had arrived 2 days earlier, along with Imogene's father, Thomas, and they had spent the last few days reacquainting themselves with the island. "A little," Imogene admitted with a laugh. "But in a good way." Eleanor stepped inside, brushing a stray lock of hair behind Imogene's ear. "You look absolutely beautiful. Your great-aunt Imogene would be so proud." The mention of her great-aunt stirred a tender ache in Imogene's chest. She had inherited this house from her namesake, and in the process, she had uncovered the love story of Patience Winthrop, a distant ancestor whose legacy had become intertwined with her own. "I hope so," Imogene whispered, glancing at the locket she now wore around her neck. The very locket that had once belonged to Patience, where they had discovered the missing ring. The locket had become a symbol not just of the past, but of the love that had endured through time, love that she had now found with Everett. "She would be," said a new voice, light and cheerful. Imogene's cousin, Hannah, stepped into the room with an armful of flowers, wildflowers, freshly picked from the fields near the house, tied together in soft hues of lavender and cream. Hannah had arrived early that morning, offering to help with any last-minute preparations. Her energy and excitement were contagious, and Imogene found herself smiling just watching her cousin bounce around the room. "Here are your flowers," Hannah said, handing them to Imogene. "I picked the best ones from the garden. They're perfect for a beach wedding." Imogene laughed, taking the bouquet and inhaling its sweet, natural scent. "They're beautiful, thank you." Hannah grinned. "Of course. And don't worry about a thing, I've been coordinating everything outside. The archway looks amazing, and the chairs are all set up facing the ocean. Miss Doris is already out there, mingling with the guests." At the mention of Miss Doris, the elderly widow who had become a fixture in the island's social scene, Imogene's heart warmed. Miss Doris had been such a key figure in her return to Palmar Island, and it wouldn't feel right to celebrate today without her. "Everything's coming together perfectly," Eleanor said, stepping back to admire her daughter. I'm going to go check on your father, make sure he hasn't misplaced his tie. You know how he is. Imogene chuckled as her mother left the room, leaving her alone with her cousin. Hannah's eyes sparkled with excitement, but there was something else there too, something more serious. Imogene, Hannah said, her voice softening as she stepped closer. I just want to say, I'm so happy for you. I know you've been through a lot, and I know it hasn't been easy. But you found something real with Everett. You deserve this happiness. Imogene blinked back tears, hugging her cousin tightly. Thank you. That means a lot. Hannah pulled back with a grin. Okay, enough of the sentimental stuff. Let's get you married. The beach was bathed in the golden hues of late afternoon, the sky a canvas of soft pinks and purples. The ocean waves rolled gently against the shore, providing a rhythmic soundtrack to the celebration. An archway made of driftwood and adorned with wildflowers stood at the edge of the sand, marking the spot where Imogene and Everett would exchange their vows. Guests were already seated, a blend of familiar faces from the island and friends from Imogene's life before she had returned. Miss Doris sat proudly in the front row, dressed in her finest, with a wide-brimmed hat that looked slightly out of place on the beach but perfectly suited her style. Beside her were Daniel and Ethan, Everett's cousins, who had arrived earlier that day with stories of their recent adventures, much to the amusement of everyone at the rehearsal dinner. And there, standing beneath the arch, was Everett. Imogene's heart fluttered at the sight of him. He was dressed in a simple but elegant suit, his dark hair tousled slightly by the ocean breeze, and his eyes were locked on her as if she were the only person in the world. She took a deep breath, her father by her side, and began the walk down the aisle. Each step felt light, as if the years of hesitation, fear, and uncertainty had lifted completely. All that remained was the present and the promise of their future. When she reached Everett, her father placed her hand in his with a warm smile. Everett squeezed her hand gently, his thumb brushing over her skin as he leaned in slightly. You look beautiful, he whispered. Imogene felt her cheeks warm, her heart swelling with love for the man standing beside her. And you look handsome. The officiant, a local from the island who had known Everett since childhood, began the ceremony with a few words about love and commitment, but Imogene found herself lost in the moment, in the way Everett looked at her as if she were the center of his universe. It was the same look he had given her when they had first solved Patience's mystery together, when they realized they were not just connected by history, but by something deeper. When it came time for their vows, Everett spoke first, his voice steady but full of emotion. Imogene, he began, his eyes never leaving hers, I've loved you for longer than I realized. You've always been in my life, in my heart, even when we were apart. When you came back to Palmar Island, I knew something was different. I knew that I didn't want to let you go again. You've shown me what it means to fight for love, to hold on to something worth keeping. And I promise, for the rest of my life, I'll never stop fighting for us. Imogene's throat tightened as tears blurred her vision, but she smiled through them, her heart overflowing with love. When it was her turn, she took a deep breath, her fingers still intertwined with Everett's. Everett, she began, her voice soft but sure, when I came back to Palmar Island, I didn't know what I was looking for. I thought I was just returning to my roots, to the past. But you've shown me that the future is what matters most. You've stood by me, through the mystery of patience, through my own fears, and you've never given up. I promise to love you, to stand by you, and to choose us every day. The moment the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, Everett wasted no time pulling her into a deep, tender kiss, the sound of the ocean and the applause of their loved ones filling the air around them. The reception was held back at the house, where lanterns hung from the trees and tables were set up in the garden, illuminated by strings of lights that twinkled as the evening sky deepened. The sound of laughter and music filled the air, and Imogene couldn't stop smiling as she and Everett danced under the stars. Hannah and Daniel were deep in conversation with Miss Doris, who was recounting a particularly funny story from her younger years, while Ethan joked with Everett about how he would never live down the day he had to chase a goat across the farm during one of his visits to the island. Imogene's parents stood nearby, watching their daughter with pride, and every now and then, her mother would dab at her eyes with a tissue. As the evening wore on and the guests slowly began to depart, Imogene and Everett found themselves standing on the porch, looking out at the sea. The house behind them was filled with the sounds of their friends and family, but for a moment, it felt like it was just the two of them. Imogene leaned into Everett, resting her head against his shoulder. "I couldn't have asked for a more perfect day." Everett wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. "Neither could I." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching as the last streaks of pink faded from the horizon, replaced by the deep blue of twilight. The gentle hum of the ocean and the soft glow of lanterns in the garden created a serene atmosphere that felt like a reflection of their journey together, quiet, steady, and full of love. Imogene's gaze drifted back toward the house, where Miss Doris was holding court with a small group of lingering guests, telling another one of her famous stories. Her parents were nearby, laughing at something Daniel had said while Hannah and Ethan shared a dance under the twinkling lights. It was everything she had ever hoped for, surrounded by the people she loved most, on the island that had come to mean so much to her. As the music from the reception faded into the background, Imogene sighed with contentment. "Do you remember when I first came back here?" she asked softly, glancing up at Everett. He smiled, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "Of course. It feels like a lifetime ago." "It does." Imogene's eyes softened as she thought back to that time, how scared she had been, not just of the ghost of Patience, but of the uncertainty in her own heart. She had been so focused on running away from the past that she hadn't realized she was running toward her future. "And now look at us," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "We've come a long way." Everett's expression softened as he pulled her closer. "We have. And we'll keep going, together." Imogene smiled, her heart full as she leaned into him. She had found everything she hadn't even known she was looking for: love, peace, and a sense of belonging. She hadn't just returned to Palmar Island to uncover the past. She had returned to build her future. "I never thought I'd end up here," Imogene said, her voice quiet but filled with contentment. "But I'm so glad I did." Everett kissed her temple, his voice low and steady. "So am I." They stood together for a few more moments, savoring the peace of the evening, before the sound of footsteps approached from behind. "There you two are," came Miss Doris's cheerful voice. "Sneaking off already?" Imogene laughed, turning to see Miss Doris approaching with a twinkle in her eye. "We weren't sneaking off. Just taking a moment." Miss Doris waved her hand dismissively. "Well, don't take too long. There's still dancing to be done, and I expect you both to join in before the night's over." Everett grinned, glancing at Imogene. "She's not going to let us escape, is she?" Imogene smiled. "Would you expect anything less from Miss Doris?" Miss Doris huffed playfully, but her expression softened as she looked at the two of them. "You two are a beautiful couple, you know that? I've seen a lot of love stories unfold on this island, but yours is something special." Imogene felt her throat tighten, touched by the sentiment. "Thank you, Miss Doris. That means a lot." Miss Doris gave them a knowing smile, her eyes twinkling in the dim light. "You're part of this island's history now, you know. And that's a legacy worth holding on to." Everett nodded, his arm tightening around Imogene. "We intend to." Miss Doris clapped her hands together, her energy returning. "Well, come on then. Let's get back to the celebration before the music stops." With a final smile, she turned and headed back toward the garden, her laughter carrying on the breeze as she joined the last of the guests. Imogene and Everett exchanged a look, both of them feeling the weight of her words. They were part of something larger now, a legacy that had begun long before them, but one they would continue to carry forward, together. "Shall we?" Everett asked, holding out his hand. Imogene took it, smiling as they walked back toward the glow of the lanterns, the music, and the laughter of their loved ones. As they stepped into the garden, the soft strains of a waltz filled the air, and Everett pulled her into his arms for one last dance under the stars. With every step, every spin, Imogene felt the fullness of everything they had built together: love, trust, and a future that stretched out before them like the endless sea. And as they danced, surrounded by the warmth of family and friends, Imogene knew that this was only the beginning. The end. This has been Whispers of Patience. Written by Susanne Ash. Copyright 2024 by Susanne Ash. Production copyright 2024 by Susanne Ash. Thanks for listening. Please like and subscribe if you want me to put more of my books on YouTube. Visit my website at www.susanneash.com for more of my books or find me on Amazon.